The Zyrith council chamber smelled like burnt copper and old pride. Every seat was filled. 43 species, 43 sets of eyes, and every single one of them staring at the same thing, the small human woman standing at the center podium like she had wandered in by accident. Her name was Dr. Mara Voss. She was 31 years old. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She was holding a coffee thermos that had a small dent on the left side, and she was reading something on her tablet like the room full of interstellar powers was a mildly inconvenient train delay. Ambassador Vreth of the Zyrith Dominion leaned toward his aide and said something. Both of them laughed. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't trying to be quiet. Mara didn't look up. The Zyrith were the oldest spacefaring civilization in this sector of the galaxy. They had been watching humans for about 60 Earth years now, ever since the first crewed faster-than-light test vehicle had punched through local space and nearly clipped one of their observation drones. Their assessment of humanity, filed in 17 different official reports, was consistent across all of them. Humans were emotional. Humans were impulsive. Humans were creative in a chaotic, unpredictable way that made them useful occasionally and dangerous sometimes, but never, not once in 60 years of documentation, had any Zyrith report used the word formidable. Mara was here because Earth's diplomatic corps had made a mistake. Not a catastrophic one. Just the kind of bureaucratic stumble that happens when 3 departments don't talk to each other and a junior coordinator accidentally submits the wrong name for the wrong summit. Dr. Mara Voss was an economic historian. She studied the collapse patterns of interstellar civilizations, specifically, how empires fall not from war but from the quiet rot that starts inside the machine long before the machine knows it is sick. She had written 4 books. None of them had titles that were easy to say at parties. She had been on her way to a conference in the Kepler Station Archive District when the reassignment message hit her calm. She had read it twice. Then, she had finished her coffee. Then, she had gone. The summit was about trade route arbitration. The Zyrith Dominion, the Sulhuri Compact, and the newly emerging Dren Federation were arguing over who controlled transit rights through the Veth Corridor, a narrow band of navigable space that sat between 3 territorial boundaries like a splinter between fingers. 6 months of negotiation had produced nothing. The Galactic Arbitration Bureau had called in observers from 17 neutral species to witness whatever came next. Earth had sent Mara. By accident. Ambassador Kale Soren of the Sulhuri Compact opened the formal session. He was tall, blue-skinned, and had the kind of effortless authority that came from centuries of his species being very good at making other species feel small. He outlined the Sulhuri position in 20 minutes of precise, beautiful language. The chamber listened with the respectful attention of people who recognized power speaking. Then, the Dren representative spoke. He was newer to galactic politics, loud in the way that people are loud when they are still figuring out that volume and confidence are not the same thing. He talked for 35 minutes. He used a lot of charts. Then, someone looked at Mara. She was still reading her tablet. Human delegate. Vreth's voice carried across the chamber with a particular kind of amusement in it, the kind that was technically polite and actually condescending. Does your species have a position it wishes to present? Or are you simply here to observe? Mara looked up. She had brown eyes and the kind of face that people consistently underestimated because it was too still and too unimpressed to register as threatening. I have some questions, she said. Vreth smiled. Several of his colleagues smiled. The Dren representative looked relieved, the way someone looks when they realize the competition is less than they feared. By all means, said Vreth. Mara set down her thermos. She pulled up something on her tablet and turned it so the chamber's shared display system could read it. A map of the Veth Corridor appeared, overlaid with something that was not a standard territorial grid. It was a trade flow chart. But not a current one. It was historical. Going back 400 years. This corridor, Mara said, has changed hands 11 times in the last 4 centuries. I've been looking at the economic data from each transfer. The Zyrith Dominion controlled it twice. The Sulhuri Compact controlled it 3 times. Various other parties held it for the remaining 6 periods. She paused. None of them profited from it the way the transit data suggests they should have. Vreth's smile did not move, but something behind it did. That's an interesting historical observation, he said. But, the current negotiation concerns present territorial rights, not past. The VETH corridor generates approximately 1.4 trillion standard credits in annual transit fees, Mara said, like he hadn't spoken. Based on the cargo manifests I pulled from the Arbitration Bureau's public archives, the actual economic activity passing through it is closer to 11 trillion. The difference is what doesn't get declared. The chamber went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of a pause. The tight, held breath quiet of a room full of very old political animals who have just heard something they were not supposed to hear said out loud. Mara took a sip of her coffee. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, she said. I'm just noting that whoever controls the corridor officially has never actually controlled what moves through it. There's a secondary transit infrastructure, it shows up in the shipping delay patterns, that operates independently of whichever government holds the transit license at any given time. She tilted her head slightly. So the question I'd like to ask is, why is everyone fighting over something that none of you actually control? Ambassador Kalesoren of the Sulhuri Compact had gone very still. He was looking at Mara the way you look at something you have just realized is not what you thought it was. Vreth spoke first. This is a significant claim. Do you have evidence beyond historical trade pattern analysis? Yes, said Mara. She pulled up another file. I have 40 years of cargo routing anomalies, 17 instances of diplomatic correspondence referencing what the Xyrath internal documents call the secondary flow, and a paper I wrote 3 years ago that nobody read because the title was too long. She paused. Also, I talked to a Dren shipping clerk at the pre-summit reception last night. He told me everything. People tell me things. I think it's because I look non-threatening. She said that last part completely flat. No irony in her voice. None needed. The chamber didn't laugh this time. Vreth and Kalesoren were looking at each other now, and it was the look of two people who have spent months trying to win a game and have just realized that neither of them actually understood what game they were playing. The Dren representative was looking at his own delegation members with the specific energy of someone trying to figure out which one of them had talked to the human woman at a party. Mara picked up her thermos again. Took another sip. Waited. She had the patience of someone who spent a lot of time in archives. She was used to sitting very still with large and complicated things and waiting for them to make sense. She did not need the room to react quickly. She did not need anyone to validate that she had just said something that mattered. She knew what she had just done. She had walked into a negotiation that had been stuck for 6 months, and, in 14 minutes, without raising her voice, she had moved the ground under everyone's feet. Not by being aggressive. Not by showing force. But by simply having read things that nobody expected her to have read, and asking the question that everyone in the room had been carefully, professionally not asking. Because the people in this room, for all their centuries of civilization and political experience, had a consistent blind spot. They underestimated what you could learn if you were quiet enough, long enough. Vreth cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should move to a closed session. That sounds fine, said Mara. She closed her tablet. Finished her coffee. I'll need access to the Xyrath Dominion's internal freight licensing records from the last 40 years. For context. Vreth stared at her. She looked back at him with her very still, very unimpressed face. You did just offer to move to closed session, she said. Where actual information gets shared. Behind her, the Galactic Arbitration Bureau's head observer, a four-armed Shellian named Savet who had been sitting in on these summits for 60 years, was writing something in his notes. He had not written anything during the previous 2 presentations. What he wrote was, watch the human outside the chamber windows. The stars were doing what stars always do, burning quietly, immovably, across distances that made most arguments look very small. Mara Voss had 3 more questions. She always started with 3. They were never the questions people expected, and they never stopped at 3. She pulled up her next file and waited for the closed session to begin. The closed session lasted 9 hours. Mara drank 4 coffees. She did not raise her voice once. By the time the chamber seals disengaged and the outer doors opened to the corridor, Ambassador Vreth of the Xyroth Dominion had aged approximately 10 years in the eyes, and Ambassador Kale Soren of the Sulhuri Compact was sitting with his hands flat on the table in front of him, staring at nothing, in the posture of a man who has just had something very large taken away from him and is still figuring out how it happened. The Dren representative had left after hour 6 to make a private comm call. He had come back looking like someone who had received very bad news very calmly. Mara had eaten a nutrition bar somewhere around hour 4. She had taken 3 notes. Everyone else in the room had taken dozens. What had happened, condensed to its bones, was this. The secondary transit infrastructure Mara had identified was not a smuggling network. It was older and more interesting than that. 400 years ago, a Sulhuri merchant consortium had built a series of waypoint stations inside the Veth corridor using shell companies registered in 11 different jurisdictions. The stations were technically unmanned, automated relay points for cargo that needed to bypass standard customs processing. Over 4 centuries, those relay stations had become the actual spine of corridor commerce. The official transit license, the thing everyone was fighting over, was essentially a ceremonial title that came with toll collection rights over about 12% of real traffic. 93% of everyone at the table had known this, in some vague, carefully not examined way, for a very long time. Nobody had said it out loud because saying it out loud would require acknowledging that the Sulhuri Merchant Consortium, which had been absorbed 300 years ago into what was now the Sulhuri Compact sovereign wealth structure, technically owned the functional infrastructure of a corridor that sat inside contested space. And that the Xyroth Dominion's historical control periods had been viable precisely because they had quiet arrangements with that infrastructure. And that the reason the Dren Federation was being so loud and aggressive about claiming the corridor was that a Dren investment group had, 18 months ago, acquired a controlling stake in the company that now held those 400-year-old station licenses. The Dren weren't trying to win the transit rights. They already had the infrastructure. They were using the territorial negotiation as cover to legitimize what they'd bought. Mara had found this in Cargo Routing Anomalies, a paper nobody had read, and a conversation with a shipping clerk at a party. She laid it out without drama. Flat, factual, referenced. She cited each source. She answered every challenge to her methodology with the specific, patient energy of someone who has spent 20 years being the only person in the room who had actually read the footnotes. Vreth had tried, twice, to reframe her analysis as speculation. The second time, she had handed him a physical printout. She carried a small portable printer in her bag, which had caused a moment of genuine confusion among the alien delegates who had not encountered one before, of a document from the Xyroth Dominion's own internal archive, declassified 3 years prior, that used the phrase secondary flow arrangement in a context that made its meaning unmistakable. He had looked at the document. He had looked at her. She had looked back at him with her very still face. "I told you I had 40 years of data," she said. That was the moment the room changed weight. Not explosively. Not dramatically. More like the way a bridge changes when too many people stop trusting it at once, a subtle, structural shift that everyone feels in their feet before anyone names it. The Arbitration Bureau observer, Savet, had called a 90-minute recess after hour 7. Mara had used the recess to find better coffee and to send 2 messages, one to Earth's diplomatic corps flagging that the situation had evolved, one to her editor noting that she might have sourced material for a 5th book. When the session resumed, the nature of the negotiation had changed entirely. It was no longer about who would control the Veth corridor. It was about what to do with the fact that the question of control was, and had always been, the wrong question. Mara proposed a framework. She had been building it in her head for about 3 hours, running it against what she knew about the collapse patterns of 4 similar historical situations, 2 in human history, 2 in the galactic record she had spent years studying in the Kepler station archives. She outlined it in 11 minutes, without notes. A joint administrative authority. Not territorial sovereignty, no one would have to concede on that politically sensitive point. Instead, a licensing and revenue-sharing body that recognized the existing infrastructure reality and distributed the proceeds according to a formula weighted toward transit volume rather than territorial claim. Nobody would win everything. Nobody would lose everything. It was the kind of solution that only works when everyone is too tired and too exposed to keep fighting, and when the person proposing it has made the cost of continuing to fight feel more real than the cost of accepting something imperfect. Mara had excellent timing. She had learned it from history. Every empire she had ever studied had ended not when its enemies got strong enough but when its own people got tired enough, and the moment to move was always the same: right after the exhaustion arrived and right before the pride reasserted itself. She moved at exactly that moment. The framework passed in principle by unanimous agreement at hour 9. Vret signed it with the expression of a man eating something that tastes bad and knowing it is good for him. Kale Soren signed it with the expression of someone who has revised their opinion of something and is choosing not to say so. The Dren representative signed it with the expression of someone who has gotten approximately 60% of what he came for and is deciding, privately, that this is acceptable. After the session, as the chamber emptied and aides scrambled to begin the actual legal drafting process, Savet approached Mara near the door. He was old. His forearms moved slowly, and there were patterns in his skin pigmentation that his species developed after about 200 years of living. He had seen a lot of these summits. "You have done this before," he said. It was not phrased as a question. Mara looked up at him. "I'm an economic historian," she said. "I study how empires fall." "And how do they fall?" "Slowly," she said. And then, because someone finally said out loud what everyone already knew. Savet was quiet for a moment. His eyes, which were multifaceted and moved independently of each other, both settled on her at the same time, which was apparently something his species only did when they were being completely serious. "You were not supposed to be at this summit," he said. "No," she agreed. "The Earth Diplomatic Corps made an administrative error." "Yes." He made a sound that his translator rendered as a thoughtful hum. "A fortunate error." "Depends on who you ask," said Mara. She capped her thermos. Picked up her bag. Paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The secondary infrastructure. The waypoint stations. You've been observing these summits for 60 years. She looked at him without any particular accusation in it. Just the flat, curious look of someone who wants to know. "Did you know?" Savet was quiet for a long time. "We observe," he said finally. "We do not intervene." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer. "Yes," he said. "I knew." Mara nodded. She had thought so. She filed it where she filed things, in the part of her brain that was always building the longer picture, the pattern under the pattern, the rot that starts before the machine knows it's sick. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "The legal drafting session starts at 9. I'll have comments on the revenue formula before then." She left. Savet stood in the emptying chamber for a while after she was gone. Then, he opened his notes and added something to the entry from this morning. He had written, "Watch the human," and now he added, "She already knows you're watching." In the corridor outside, Mara was walking with the unhurried stride of someone who was not in a hurry because they had already done what needed doing. She passed 2 Xyrath aides who were speaking in their own language in low, urgent tones. She did not appear to be listening. She was listening. She had been learning Xyrath for about 8 months, from a text she had found in the Kepler Station archive district that was labeled as a linguistic analysis document and was actually a functional grammar guide. It was not perfect Xyrath. But it was enough. What the aides were saying, translated roughly, was asterisk who authorized the Earth delegation to access the transit archive data? Someone in our office gave them level 3 clearance by mistake. Asterisk Mara turned a corner. She had not been given level 3 clearance by mistake. She had been given exactly the clearance she had applied for, under a research access provision in the Galactic Academic Exchange Treaty that the Xyrath had signed 40 years ago and apparently never expected anyone to actually use. Nobody reads the footnotes. She found the good coffee vendor 3 corridors down. She had located it on her first day and ordered another cup. She had 4 more hours of work before she could sleep, and the revenue formula draft needed to be typed before morning, because the legal teams were going to try to soften the volume weighting mechanism and she needed the math to be bulletproof before they got their hands on it. She sat down at a small table near the window. Pulled out her tablet. Opened her notes. Outside, the Veth corridor stretched across the display maps and the corridor newsfeeds, that narrow strip of navigable space that 400 years of civilization had been arguing about and approximately nobody had understood. She understood it now. She understood what it was worth, who really controlled it, why every previous negotiation had collapsed, and what would happen if the joint authority framework wasn't structured correctly in the next 48 hours. She also understood, in the quieter part of her mind that she rarely spoke out loud, that what had happened today was not really about a trade corridor. It was about what gets built when powerful old systems stop asking the right questions. About the particular vulnerability of institutions that have been dominant long enough to mistake their own assumptions for facts. About how the rot starts not in war rooms or border skirmishes, but in the 40-year-old documents nobody reads and the shipping clerk at a party who assumes the quiet woman in the corner isn't paying attention. She had 3 books about this. She might need a 4th. She sipped her coffee. Opened the revenue formula document. Started reading. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, and the legal teams were going to put up a fight, and Vreth was going to attempt to reopen the infrastructure ownership question at least twice, and Mara was going to need to be patient and precise and absolutely unmovable in the specific, quiet way that she had been unmovable her entire career. She was good at that. She had been practicing since before anyone in this building knew her name. The legal drafting took 3 days. Mara slept 5 hours a night, which was less than she preferred but more than the Xyrath legal team expected anyone to function on. By day 2 they had stopped underestimating her schedule. By day 3 they had stopped underestimating her entirely, which was a shift she noted with the same quiet, unsurprised attention she gave most things. The revenue formula held. The volume weighting mechanism held. Vreth tried to reopen the infrastructure ownership question, as Mara had predicted, and she had the legal text ready, pre-drafted, footnoted, referencing 3 specific clauses from the Galactic Commerce Accords that the Xyrath themselves had co-authored in 2187 before he had finished the sentence. He had looked at her across the table with something she had not seen in his face before. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. The specific expression of someone intelligent enough to recognize when they are outmatched and honest enough, barely, to feel something about it. She didn't rub it in. She never did. She just moved to the next agenda item. On the 4th day, the framework was signed into binding preliminary agreement and transmitted to the Galactic Arbitration Bureau for formal ratification. Every major newsfeed in this sector ran the headline within the hour. The Veth Corridor settlement was described, depending on the outlet, as a diplomatic breakthrough, an unexpected compromise, or a quiet revolution in interstellar transit law. None of them mentioned Mara by name in the headline. She was mentioned in paragraph 4 of most articles as the Earth delegation's economic consultant, which was not technically her title but was close enough that she didn't bother correcting it. She was eating breakfast alone in the station's lower-level food court when the message from Earth's diplomatic corps arrived. It was effusive in the way that official messages are effusive when the people sending them are embarrassed about a previous mistake and trying to compensate with enthusiasm. There were words like extraordinary and unprecedented and the Secretary General extends her personal congratulations. Mara read it once. Filed it. Ordered more coffee. Savet found her there, which she had half expected. He moved slowly for someone 4 hours from the end of a 4-day summit, but he moved like he knew where he was going, and he sat down across from her with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided to say something they have been thinking about for a while. The Galactic Arbitration Bureau, he said, has a standing request process for observer consultants. Species with demonstrated analytical value in settlement proceedings. Mara looked at him over her coffee. You want to recruit me, she said. I want to offer you access, he said. There are 47 active disputes in current Bureau mediation. Some of them have been active for decades. Several of them involve infrastructure questions similar to what you identified here. He paused. His multifaceted eyes did the full focus thing again. You would not be required to intervene in any of them. You would have archive access and observer status. What you did with that would be your decision. Mara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking, but her face didn't show the thinking, it showed the same still, unimpressed calm it always showed, which was why people consistently failed to understand that she was the most dangerous person in any room she was in. Not dangerous in the way that word usually gets used. She didn't carry weapons. She had never raised her voice in a negotiation. She did not project authority or perform confidence or use the social tools that power usually uses to announce itself. She was dangerous the way that a very specific and very thorough understanding of how things actually work is dangerous when deployed in rooms full of people who have confused their own convenience with reality. She thought about the 47 active disputes. She thought about the 4 books she had written about collapse patterns, and the 5th book she had been thinking about since the closed session 2 days ago, and the fact that every empire she had ever studied had made the same category of mistake, treating the map as the territory, the official record as the actual history, the loud claim as the real ownership. She thought about the shipping clerk who had told her everything at a reception because she had asked him one question and then listened without interrupting, which was apparently unusual enough to make him feel, as he later told a colleague, that she was the most interesting person at the party. "I want a specific access level," she said. Sauvet waited. "Full archive access, not observer limited. Academic research rights for anything I identify as historically relevant. And I want the same courtesy extended to my graduate students, because I'm not doing this alone and the next generation of people who read footnotes should have the same access I do." Sauvet made the thoughtful hum sound. "That is a more significant request than most observer consultants make." "Yes," said Mara. "You understand that observer consultants do not typically shape active negotiations." "I understand that's the official framing," she said. "I also understand that what I actually do when I'm in a room is provide information, and that people make decisions based on information, and that you cannot separate those two things cleanly no matter what the role is officially called." Another long pause. Sauvet had the quality of very old things, not slowness, but weight. The sense that each word was placed deliberately and that he had a very long view of what mattered. "You know," he said, "in 6 decades of observing these proceedings, I have seen 4 cases where a single delegate's intervention changed the structural outcome. Not the surface outcome, the structural one. The one that shapes the next 100 years." Mara waited. "The Veth corridor will now be a model," he said. "The joint administrative authority framework you drafted will be cited in the next generation of trade route disputes. The way revenue is calculated volume over territorial claim will become a standard. Other parties will read the agreement and build arguments based on it. Scholars will write about it." He paused. "And the secondary infrastructure reality you surfaced will now be the lens through which analysts examine every other major corridor dispute in this sector." Mara nodded slowly. She had known this. It was the reason the revenue formula had needed to be bulletproof, not just functional. You write for the case in front of you and for the 30 cases that will cite it afterward. "The access," said Sauvet, "will be granted as you described. Including for your graduate students." She nodded again. Took a sip of coffee. "One question," said Sauvet. "And I ask it genuinely, not as a formality." "Go ahead." "The Earth Diplomatic Corps sent you here by mistake. If they hadn't made that administrative error, if the correct delegate had attended this summit, what would have happened to the Veth corridor dispute?" Mara thought about this. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she believed in saying things carefully when the careful version was the accurate one. "It would have collapsed again," she said. "Another 6 months of negotiation, another failed session, another decade of the same cycle. Because the correct delegate would have been trained in interstellar diplomatic procedure and current political relationships. They would have been very good at the game everyone was playing." She set down her coffee. "But the game was wrong. Nobody trained in the right game would have looked for the wrong game underneath it. And you looked for it because that's what collapse looks like," she said. "An institution so committed to the official version of events that it can't see the actual structure underneath. I have studied 46 cases of it. Across human history and the galactic record. Every single time, the thing that brings the institution down is not the enemy at the gates. It is the 40-year-old document in the archive that nobody read, describing the real situation in language that was polite enough to be ignored." She picked up her bag. She had a transit shuttle in 2 hours, back to Kepler Station, back to the archive district, back to her office with the 3 monitors and the good chair and the stacks of physical documents that her graduate students called aggressively retro and that she called reliable. "The Zyrith laughed at me," she said. "Not with anger. Just noting it. A data point. On the first day. before I said anything. I know, said Savette. I saw. That's useful information, she said. Savette tilted his head slightly. Useful how? Because it tells me what they expected. And what they expected tells me what they're not looking for. And what powerful institutions aren't looking for is always where the real leverage is. She paused at the edge of the table, bag over her shoulder, thermos in hand. I've been the person they don't expect my whole career. It's the most useful thing I own. She left. Back at Kepler Station, 2 weeks later, a package arrived at her office. It was from the Galactic Arbitration Bureau, a physical credential, which was unusual, and, apparently a significant honor among the Bureau's older member species. Savette had included a handwritten note, 4 lines, in his species script. She had to look up 2 of the characters. The translation came out as, *, the quiet ones always know more than the room. The room is only beginning to learn this about you, *. She put the credential in her desk drawer. The note she kept out, because it was the kind of thing that made a good reminder when a drafting process was going badly and the footnotes were refusing to cooperate. Her graduate students, all 7 of them, received their archive access credentials 3 days later. 4 of them immediately started pulling records on active disputes. One of them, a 24-year-old from Lagos named Temi who had the same kind of patient stillness Mara recognized from her own early career, sent a message at 11 at night that said only, *, I found something in the Drethry compact records. Can we meet tomorrow? Mara replied, 7 am. Bring everything, *. She closed her tablet. Looked at the window, the long view through the station glass toward the starfield, toward the Veth corridor running invisible through deep space 40 light-years out, toward the 47 disputes that were now, quietly, within reach of someone who read the footnotes. She finished her coffee. She was not a soldier. She had never held a weapon, never commanded a fleet, never made the kind of move that gets statues built or songs written or names remembered in the loud parts of history books. She had done something harder and more permanent. She had changed the framework. The way the question gets asked. The level at which the answer gets looked for. That kind of change doesn't announce itself. It shows up 30 years later in how institutions make decisions and what documents get treated as real and which shipping clerks at parties someone bothers to listen to. Empires fall slowly. And, then, they fall because someone finally said out loud what everyone already knew. Mara Voss was already reading the next file. She was already building the next question. She was already, in the unhurried and completely unstoppable way of someone who has spent a lifetime being the person no one was watching, taking apart the next thing that needed taking apart. The stars outside burned the way stars always burn. Patient and immovable across distances that make most arguments feel very small. Mara had never found that discouraging. She found it clarifying. Out there, in 47 disputed corridors and border zones and transit claims, in decade-old archives and untranslated documents and the cargo manifests of ships that moved through spaces nobody officially controlled, the real story was written in the margins, the footnotes, the data that didn't match the official record. She was going to read all of it. She always did.